Okay, hello. I'm making another update for the Classy UI tool. We've done a lot of stuff, and the tool is really shaping to become something else than I thought it would be initially. Because we started like just building on top of Tailwind CSS, and then we created this plugin. And now what we're seeing is that we are actually building like a framework to build design systems. So if you imagine Tailwind CSS is a very integrated way of defining the design system and consuming it. But what we're doing is making it so generic that you could very easily create your completely from scratch your version of Tailwind CSS. So you can imagine having many different design systems that you could very easily consume with this tool. So what I'm doing here, I'm setting up a Git book for Classy UI. And as I'm writing here, it's like we're just playing around with this now, but trying to figure out what this is. But like a framework for building and consuming design systems that automatically configures itself based on the application code. Yes. So you have like a consuming part of it, and that's what you do in your application where you consume these different class names. But then you also have, which has not been published, but will be published very soon, is how you build it. So one part of this that we can do with the plugin is the consumption part, but we can also do a lot of cool stuff with the configuration. So I've been playing around with different ideas, and I landed on a configuration concept I'm super stoked about, because it's not the way you configure Tailwind CSS. It's lower level than that, which is why you can build so many different design systems. But I have actually implemented Tailwind CSS in this configuration tool, and I'm going to show you exactly how that looks. But what you can do is, in this configuration, you can extend an existing design system. So in this case, Tailwind CSS, and then you can manipulate that and make changes to it. But you can also go completely from scratch. And the way this is built up is that you have variables, which are the dynamic parts of the design system. So for example, you might have colors that you use for different things. You might have spacing you use for different things. You might have breakpoints you use for different things. So those are the variables. And when you're theming the design system, it's the variables you are changing. It's not the class names and stuff, it's the variables. So you kind of like, as a design system builder, expose these variables so that to the themes. Those are like the dynamic parts of the system, and then the class names and everything will just point to that correctly. And then you have the class names themselves. So you give it like a base name of, like, for example, color, and then you have variants. These variants can of course be hard-coded, so you have like color-red, color-blue, but you can also use the variables. So in this case, I'm just grabbing the colors variable, and we are using those. So we get an object of red here. And then you define, how do we actually want to define the CSS of this class name? And this is the really cool part. Because now we are taking the value, which will be red in this case, and we are inserting that in the body of a CSS, like a CSS declaration or whatever we're going to call it, and you just insert it there. So if there were multiple colors, you would get multiple of these. Now, the really cool thing is that you can have multiple properties here. So for example, if you had a variant called padding horizontal, you could insert padding left and padding right here. So you can have multiple properties. You can even have these preset pseudo selectors. So for example, placeholder is this crazy weird pseudo selector thing. So you can even play around with that. Yes. So what's changing now is that we're also focusing on the designer here, because this is of course part of a design system. You really want this tight relationship between the designer, like the designer and the developer has to meet somewhere. And this is one take on where they can meet. So the developer and the designer, they talk about like the design system, what variables do you want to expose, like colors and spacing and stuff. Also, what screens do we want to support? I didn't mention that. There's also screens property here. Sorry, the documentation is not ready. Which manages media queries and stuff. And then you define like a consumable set of design tokens and their variants. And that is basically the class names here. So you talk the same language, like the designs and the way you consume that design in the code. It's token based. So you're talking about the same stuff. That's really important. Yes. And then from the perspective of the developer, I talked about all this, like there's no CSS when you start. It's only generated when you start consuming it. You can dynamically add pseudo selectors like hover and stuff, and it produces the exact CSS that's needed for that. You get typing automatically based on the configuration of the design system. So you get like inline not recommendations, but auto suggestions. And if you use class names that's not configured in the design system, you will actually get an error. Okay, so let's look at a Tailwind configuration so that you kind of like see how we would be able to build the same kind of design systems as Tailwind CSS, but only different. But before we do that, I want to talk about one thing that we have worked on and solved, and that is specificity. Because in, let's see, how to consume. So we support compositions. Which means that since we're in JavaScript, you could define like a set of class name as a button, for example. And then you want to compose in the button into an alert button, where you have a different background color and a text color. But the problem is that now you have two background colors, two class names. And sorry to say, the order of the class names doesn't affect which class name has higher precedence. It's the order in the CSS. And that's called a specificity issue. And that's very, very challenging to handle with different solutions. Like Tailwind CSS has a few sections on how to manage specificity and how they occur and stuff. But we actually managed to completely remove it. And that's so fascinating about this approach with the plugin, is that we can handle things very differently. We don't have to fix it in the CSS itself. We can actually fix it in the code you consume. So let's look at handling specificity. Okay, so we handle it in the code you produce instead of in the CSS definition. So again, we have a button where we have two background colors being composed on top of each other. And that is, let's see. Okay, so red button will look like this, and that's a problem because you have two backgrounds. So what we do here is that when this code is produced, like this is the result, the plugin will initially insert this, we are actually able to change this around. We can actually say that, sorry, this is not what the button will insert. Sorry, this is not what the plugin will insert. This is what the plugin will insert. But this is like what's underneath. Like that's what it evaluates to in the JavaScript runtime. But if we look at this, we know that you want a background color in this composition. And this is the one you want because that's the one you define in the composition. So it basically means that if you have a background color inside the button, we don't want that background color to be there. And this is what the plugin actually handles now. So instead of evaluating to this, it evaluates to something like this. So what it basically does is take the part you composed in, which is the button. it looks at the specific class names you wanted to have in that composition, which is in this case is background color. It knows that background color is a type of class name here. So it's able to now replace all the background colors in the button, and then we add the one you actually want. So that means that we handle the specificity issue in the definition of the class names instead of the CSS, and that's so much easier to do. And we don't have to generate special classes or anything related to compositions, because it's impossible to have compositions that has duplicate versions of the same type of that has duplicate class names of the same type. So that's really, really cool. Okay, so let's look at how Tailwind CSS is defined. So first of all, we have some variables. We have the breakpoints, we have the spacing, and we have the colors. So those are the variables. And then we have the screens. So here you see an example of screens. So screens are defined also by a function where you receive the CSS that's to be included inside the media query. So in production, that would be a lot of CSS, probably. But in development, that would be typically for single class names. Doesn't matter. So what we do here is that we insert, so this should actually be changed because we actually get the breakpoints here. So we could say breakpoints, what was it? Breakpoints SM, I guess. Yes. Breakpoints.sm. I will fix these later. And that means that if you were to update the breakpoints related to a theme, those would actually be affected, like the screens here would be affected by that. All the media queries, which is kind of cool. Anyways, so those are the screens, and here you can write whatever media query you want. And then we have the class names. So one way to define a class name is to just use a function. This is like a static class name. Well, not necessarily static, but because you do get the variables here if you need them. But it's a single CSS definition for this class name. And then we have the typical definition, where we have the variants, where the empty object here reflects to just using flex in this case. So the class name will be flex, and that points to this one. And then with one, it will be flex-1 and flex-auto, initial, and blah, blah, blah. And here you can see how we are also able to handle different ways of building up the CSS. So in this case, our variants are actually using different properties. So one of them is using display, one is flex, and we also have flex direction, but we all want this stuff to be underneath flex because that makes sense from a consumption point and just defining tokens and stuff in a design system. So the value we get here is actually the content of the CSS body. So that is why we do it like this. And then we have, for example, let's do another example. Blah, blah, blah. Okay, so here we have the colors, where we just grab all the CSS colors. And here we define in the how to produce a CSS function, we define color because everyone uses the same property. Yes, I guess, yeah, so everything is like in here. And what's really cool is that we don't have anything related to pseudo selectors and stuff. Yeah, I wanted to show you this. So building up the different margins and stuff. Here we're grabbing the spacing and we're using JavaScript to produce all these different class name variations. So, or variants. So here we're iterating the spacing, and then we are creating some CSS based on that, which is margin and the spacing key. So if we look way up to the top here, we have different spacing. like 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And that is also what we get here. So we get like M0, M-1, M-2, M-4, M-8, and so on. And it will use the correct margin key value here. And then we can do the same for MI, MX, where we have different properties, and we're dynamically building up everything here. So that's really, really, really cool. And here we can see we are adding the spacing, but we also have custom stuff related to width. And yeah, so I think this is a really good test for this API of building up the design system, because we are able to build everything that Tailwind CSS has, and it's a complex design system. Yeah, cool. And on top of that, it will, based on that configuration, it will generate all the typing for you. As I said, the plugin itself will yell at you if you're using class names that's not part of the design system, and so on. Yes. And in terms of theming, I mentioned that. I don't know if I have an example here. I think I do. Again, it's not really done yet. Yes. So the only thing you do to define themes is that, oh, that's a typo. Anyways, you define themes in the configuration, and then you override the variables. So the variables is the dynamic part of your design system, and that is what the theme is able to override to adjust it. So you decide what variables, how dynamic should your design system be. So basically, more variables, the more dynamic the design system is. Cool. Yes, I guess that's what I wanted to show. There's still a bit of documentation that needs to go in here. We need to publish the latest version of the plugin. But I wanted to give you like a technical overview of what we're doing and where like the project is headed. Please let me know what you think about this. Does it seem exciting to like have this configuration API to build up a similar design system like Tailwind CSS? Does it make sense in terms, do you work with a designer? Does this make sense? Is this something you could work together on? Yeah, stuff like that. Cool. I guess that's it. Thanks for listening, and talk to you later.